starting. It says this hangout on air is live. Maybe I should turn off this prison documentary that I'm watching. How do I turn this off? I watch prison documentaries to keep me scared of doing something irrational. So, how's everything going?
Well, fine. Is it late over at your time now?
It is 5:06 a.m. in Miami, Florida.
Oh, it's morning.
Yeah, I've been up since like 2 in the morning. I can't sleep, so I done walked my dog, fell asleep with my dog, and like, I don't know. It is what it is. Well, you're in Denmark, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's about 11 o'clock in the morning now, almost noon.
Okay. Mark, like, really respect you. You already know that. I think I told you I'm like one of your groupies. I'm a groupie of several people, probably half a dozen. But there's some things that I'm curious about. Like this, I would like this to be a conversation versus me interviewing you, even though I'll probably have a lot of questions. But you
Sure.
know, something I'm really curious about, and like you're really humble. Like ah, I don't want to be offensive, but I have a hard time believing that you're like this in private life. Like sooner or later, you have to acknowledge how brilliant you are and how other people are. But I probably won't go down that path. What I've been going, or I think I've been going full throttle in my career in regards to my passion of continuous improvement. But I recognize that I've made sacrifices, and I'm still not at the point where I'm content within my career. But I also recognize that there's some things that I perceive as being out of balance in regards to my private life, friends, family, etc. I'm not asking you to put your life out in the public spotlight, but is is, is there any words of wisdom that you can recommend for people that are really aggressive or would like to be aggressive in pursuing their dreams professionally?
I don't know if it's going to be wisdom. I think I can tell you what I did because you talked about sacrifices, and I've made a couple of those myself. Um, you know, in general, I'm pretty happy with where I am, and I've actually managed to get this far without actually, going through the route of having a divorce or anything. So I'm still married to the same woman, and that's wonderful. But I have been, doing a lot of other things where I had to, select, that, I'm going to do this instead of this. And I think I can't remember whether this was, David Heinemeier Hansen or John Sonmez, or maybe both of them. But some people say, well, one sacrifice you can do is actually stop watching television. So I did that. I haven't really had a TV since I moved out of my parents' home, and that's like more than 20 years ago. So just not having a TV just frees up a lot of time doing other things. And another thing I think I might say about where I am in my career at the moment is that I've spent a lot of time actually just thinking about things that are related to the profession of software development. And to me, that has not been a sacrifice, but to some people it might be. But I just I can't help it. I just think it's super interesting, all of these stuff. So I just spend more time that I actually have to tinkering with stuff and so on. And it seems like I just heard your .NET Rocks episode yesterday, the one with F Sharp and mobile development, and it sounds like you actually spend a lot of time actually doing extra curricular stuff as well. So
I'm trying.
yeah. But I think it's not sustainable if you don't think it's sort of fun. Sometimes it can be super frustrating, but still you have to have just a certain level of interest in what you're doing, because otherwise it will become a chore, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You know what I noticed is I don't really watch TV that much, with the exception of documentaries and movies, right? I watch movies, but I can't really get into sitcoms at all. Like make believe lives, like like, I only have one life to live because I don't really have religion. So it's like, well, I need to focus on myself. I'm going to watch some imaginary characters live. Like, I don't get that part, but in a way, uh, I think there's some value in it. And it's like, well, why would I think there's value in watching imaginary characters and gossiping about, hey, did you see the last episode of whatever last night, at the lunch table at company XYZ? This is what I have reason to believe. I've been so isolated in my box and trying to focus on programming and how to deliver faster with higher quality that I'm not sure if it's my lack of watching television the way that other people watch television, because it's more of learning, and then movies is the entertainment. But I'm curious if there's a lack of social intelligence, or for lack of a better term, um, especially as I'm not sure if I'm still considered a young man, but being able to relate to society, being able to relate to or attract the opposite sex, and with emphasis on relate, regardless of me not valuing what the masses value. I think it's important to be able to relate to the common man or common woman. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
So do you sometimes find it difficult to just, keep small talk going, for example?
Uh, if you notice, or maybe you haven't, I tend to ask random people in tech if they want to record a conversation with me,
Sure.
because I could talk your ear off about technology, right?
Sure.
Um, but if I go to a sports bar and I'm with my friends back home, or I just decide to walk into a random sports bar in Miami, one is, why am I watching someone else play with the ball? I want to play with the ball.
Sure.
Like, why am I rooting for somebody else? I want to do it, right? So I'm not that much of a spectator, but yeah, like ping pong or whatever. But besides that, it's like I have a hard time understanding why people get excited talking about how other people live.
Fair enough.
I can't really relate to it, but apparently this is normal. And so to answer your question, when I have something in common with people, of course I could talk your ear off. But
Sure.
if it's something I'm just not interested in, and I'm scratching my head like, why do you care so much about this reality star? What has this person done for you?
Right.
I pretty much just shut down. I just keep drinking, and that's it.
It's always a good strategy, though.
Yeah.
Or not. Yeah, I just came off. I just came off a month, with no alcohol at all, and that was a very long month. So, well, so one thing that I think that I've realized, or beginning to realize, is that I think I was probably a pain in the ass when I was younger, because I don't really have natural social graces, if you will. So I could be really persistent in my talking about things that other people didn't care about, and not particularly interested in what they were caring about. And as far as I can tell, there is a. Are you there still? Or?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, you're just so silent that I was almost thinking maybe they hang
I
out
am your student.
friends.
All I do is keep my mouth shut and I listen.
No, that's fine. Well, so I've been beginning to think, and I'm not alone in this, that there's this thing called autism, which is sort of like a not a mental disorder, but way that people's personalities configured. And you've probably, if you've ever seen the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise, you know what sort of some a little bit about autism, but not really. But it seems like it's more like a spectrum. So instead of just being an on-off thing, either you're autistic or you're not, it seems like there's sort of a spectrum where you can be more or less social, and more or less within your own mind, if you will. And And I think I'm probably a little bit to the side of people being, I'm not really good at reading other people. I need to be very conscious about trying to understand what's going on in my surroundings when it comes to other people. I don't pick it up naturally, and it sounds a little bit like maybe you're like that. I get the feeling that a lot of people in tech are like that, because we sort of self-select into an industry where it's easier to deal with a computer than actually deal with another human being.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with you at all? Sometimes, at least the computer is sort of like you understand why it's, even if you can't get it to do what it is that you want it to do, you sort of understand that it's not because you misread it or anything. You just you haven't really thought things through to the level where you need to think it through, if that makes sense.
Well, I look at it, if we're talking about like programming, it's a form of my own expression. No one can tell me the one and only correct way, unless it's you, of how to submit statements to the machine for execution. And so, like, I mean, I get into it because I have my own imagination that I get to put on the editor, and I get to watch it fail until it finally passes, and then I get to refine it, refine it, refine it until I start having admiration for it. But it's just something I'm curious about. I kind of, even though when I talk to people and ask if they would like to have a conversation with me, I tell them no, there's no agenda. I singled you out because I wanted to learn about your thoughts about the lifestyle. I'm not sure if you feel comfortable calling yourself a software craftsman, but the lifestyle of an invested programmer, or whatever you want to
Sure,
call it.
sure.
And so, like, and we kind of discussed it already. I guess I don't want this to be an interview, right? But like, when is enough enough? Like, when have you said? uh, when have you like had a thought to yourself or had a conversation with someone or even yourself in the mirror and said, you know what? I'm satisfied with going deep into this journey or this path, and I think I have other interests. Because I think the definition of a genius is someone that will spend their whole life focused on one thing. Of course, that's probably not Webster's dictionary, but someone that is usually obsessed with a certain specific niche. Like, when is it enough?
I don't think it's ever going to be enough, but, and I'm not sure I'm not sure that I agree or, I share your definition of a genius, but I just think, if you start considering just what's in, the area of software development, you can keep on learning and you will never stop learning until, well, you can decide that enough is enough and you don't want to learn anymore, but there will always be more to learn. It's quite clear that the sum of all human knowledge is more than you can, absorb in a lifetime. So I think you just need to get to, you just have to accept that, that you will never learn all of it. And then it's just your decision. Do you want to keep on learning, or are you happy with that? And I've met lots of developers who are sort of happy enough with what they've learned so far, and they're not really interested in learning much more. And I think that's probably some of the types of developers that you're sometimes, battling with when you're talking about, how
Oh, you've
difficult it
heard.
is. Yeah, how difficult it is to get people to do TDD or whatever, because you're running into that sort of developer who are basically, content with where they already are. But I'm just not that type of person. I've always been curious, learning how things relate to each other and how the world works, if you will. And I'm also very curious about that in software development. And I definitely realize that that's not going to stop until I die. Basically, that's fine. I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I'm starting to. I have a bachelor's in computer science, and like the reason I'm saying that is it wasn't until I started getting more advanced within my career. I'm not even sure if advanced is the right term, based on my insecurities, that I recognize that the human factor is just, I wasn't prepared for. And so now I'm like reconsidering watching TV and being able to relate and understand human beings that aren't as invested in their practice as I would like to be. And so, yeah, I mean, this has blindsided me. And so it's something that I want to embrace as a challenge, so that it can further define me and increase my worth. Um, I'm not asking you to talk about your experiences, but surely you have banged your head against the wall and asked yourself, why is this so challenging to do what you believe is the right thing,
Right.
especially if you can measure it.
But we can't. So the problem with software development is basically that we don't really know how to measure what it is that we're doing. So, and I recently talked to Dave Rail about this, on his Developer on Fire podcast. So not to reiterate everything here, but basically, I'm more and more coming to the conclusion that we don't really have good ways of measuring, the value of the software that we actually create. We may think we can measure it, but mostly that's not really the case. It doesn't mean that we don't have any, sense of whether what we're doing is good or not, because I think we have. What I asked Dave Rail is that, think about someone you deeply love, and that could be a spouse or a parent or a child or whatever, and then tell me, what's the measure, what's the value of that love, and you can't. You can't really measure, the thing like, how much do you appreciate another human being? And the point with that question, though, is that there are, we should realize that there are things that are valuable, even though we can't measure them. And I think software is one of those things where we say, well, clearly, we believe that the software that we are creating is valuable. And as long as we believe that, we can continue on working on that software. And if we stop believing that the software is valuable, we'd probably stop, working on that as well. But I don't think we can measure it at all. So we need to have, different approaches to, figuring out how do we actually proceed with the development efforts overall. And I think it's more like an art project than it's actually about engineering, exactly because we can't really measure it at all. So we need to have, some sort of common understanding.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sure.
I missed the last 5 seconds of what you were saying because of connectivity.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so basically I just said, well, I think software development is more like an art project, than it's actually engineering, in the sense that we need to have some sort of common understanding of where it is that we want to go, and we need to be happy with it and have a good feeling about it. But it's really fluffy, it's not really something that is particularly measurable. But you'll get lots of software development organizations that think they can measure the value of the software. And what often happens then is that if they actually believe that they can do that, what they typically measure is story points, or they measure, your features, or they measure, how much money have we actually made from this website today, and so on. And the problem with that is that if that's the only thing you measure, you have no motivation for actually thinking about long-term maintainability, like, what we typically call, code quality, like, is the code readable, is it testable, and all of those things, because they're not immediately measurable.
Yeah, so the point that I was getting to, or that I wanted to point out, was I thought that leveraging, static analysis tools, that you could measure the maintainability of a solution based on the algorithms used for a given IDE. Is that accurate, or still no?
I don't think so. I don't believe in that at all. It's not that I don't care about those numbers as such, but let's talk about, one of the, if you take a Visual Studio, for example, it has this maintainability index. And one of the components of the maintainability index that Visual Studio calculates is
Cyclomatic
cyclomatic complexity. but it's, cyclomatic complexity is actually really difficult to, figure out exactly, how do we actually measure that? It's easy enough to, it's easy enough to define it, because you say, well, you just count every branch in your code, and then you have the number of cyclomatic complexity. But then you go and look at, then you have, stuff like link expressions in C#, for
Yeah, it
example.
destroys it.
And
I
then you
know
go,
that.
well, that is an expression. It doesn't look like a branch, but it's actually a select in link is actually a for loop, sort of. So that ought to count against cyclomatic complexity. But do you actually count it? Because it's not really a piece of cyclomatic complexity in your code. It's a piece of cyclomatic complexity in in the link implementation. And that becomes even more horrible when you start looking at discriminated unions in F# or in other functional programming languages, because now you have
It's not even supported.
yeah, but even if it were, if you look at a map, a list map or an option map, for example, option is, if anyone else is listening here, in F#, option is a discriminated union that could be either, has a value or it will not have a value. And you can actually map over that as well. So in Haskell, this would be what we call a functor, because it has, a map function as well. So if you map over an optional value, that means that if it has a value, that map will actually be executed. But if it doesn't have a value, that map will not be executed. Is that also, does that also count as cyclomatic complexity? It probably ought to, in the sense that there are more, there are more ways through your function, because the function deals with whether a value is there or not. But it's not something you really think much about when you just write the code, because it's just sort of like an expression.
So
If that makes sense.
yeah, I think so. So how do you, Mark Seeman, gain confidence that you're writing maintainable code? Is it just you looking at it, say this is good? You don't rely on any type of external tool, so you don't rely on the machine to give you its opinion?
I take whatever I can get.
Okay.
So I used lots of static code analysis when I wrote C# code. And if that existed for F#, I'd take it. Actually, if you install Visual F# power tools into Visual Studio, it actually comes with a linter. So the linter, if you turn it on, will actually give you squiggly lines under some of the things and say, well, you could actually express this, in a more idiomatic way, and so on. So I have this turned on, and I usually follow the advice that it gives me. Sometimes there are reasons why I can't, but I find that valuable. I'm not, I'm not perfect at all, so I'll take I'll take all the help that I can get, as long as the help is not too difficult to get.
Yeah.
But I'll take it. So if there was built-in static code analysis for F# like there is for C#, for example, I'd turn it on and I'd run it, because I'm not perfect, so it might as well get some advice. And I also, I'm working for a client at the moment and actually writing F# code, and all the F# code that I write, I submit, as pull requests, and someone else reviews it. And occasionally they actually point out, you should probably do this instead of this, and I go, oh, okay, yeah, well, I was being lazy here, but you're right, I'll do it. I do not consider myself perfect at all. So whenever I can get help to make the code better, then I'll take it.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, but still, but I still write lots of unit tests. I use property-based testing now, but it's still unit tests. So that gives me a confidence that the code works to a certain degree also. But do I know if it's maintainable? Not really. Not really.
Well, everything you're writing is functions now, right?
Yeah.
Well, for the most part,
Sure.
until you deal with the I/O, and maybe you still do functions somehow. But I mean, doesn't that already mean that? I understand that just because it's testable doesn't mean it's necessarily maintainable.
Sure.
But I think it increases maintainability in regards to refactoring. I don't know. I'm still learning as I'm going. But
Right. No, well, I am still learning as I'm going, it never stops. And that's fine. But, I have a pretty low tolerance to things being awkward or difficult to work with, if you will. So, I have a good friend who I really respect a lot as a software developer, was originally a colleague of mine. But, all people have their flaws, and one of his flaws is that I think he has too high a pain threshold. So basically, sometimes when I look at the code he's written, I'm sort of like, how can you even stand working with that? Because it's so complicated and convoluted that I can't reason about that. I think it's too difficult. But he's sort of like, yeah, well, just carry on, and it's ugly, but it sounds like he's a horrible developer. He's actually really, really good, because there's a lot of other things he does really, really well. But he's just, I have a pretty low tolerance for when things become complicated. So as soon as, a function or a piece of code, expands more than, one screen, for example, I get a very, very strong urge to refactor it so that it fits at least on a screen again. Because if I can't watch all of it in a single screen, then I find it difficult to read. So I find it difficult to understand. And that's when it's difficult to understand, it's difficult to maintain, if that makes sense.
that's your code though. Or like, do you spend most of the time being the single developer, being the single trusted developer, or are you? I can't imagine you working on normal teams. I can't.
I don't know what a normal team is.
I don't have any hair left anymore because it all came out. Right.
I don't really know what a normal team is. I did also see you had a discussion with Scott Larsen, early on, and he said that most of the teams he's been working on were actually. It didn't sound like he was too impressed by the people there, but he was sort of he made things work anyway. I've had a little bit of a different experience throughout my lifetime. When I started out, I probably worked with normal teams, if you will, but I didn't know any better myself. So, I was not a particularly good developer when I started. I had to learn it first. So I probably didn't notice even. But later on, I managed to put myself into organizations where I actually think that, they were pretty decent. I did work 1.5 years for Microsoft they actually have a development center here in Copenhagen. So they were doing all the Microsoft things, but they were actually doing Agile as well. So they were doing TDD and so on. And one of the reasons why I took that job was exactly because I thought, it's interesting that they're working in this way, and I want to be part of that, if that makes sense. So I've always been quite, to the extent that I've been able to do so, I've always picked the jobs that, looked like it was, that they actually offered a way of working that I thought was interesting. Mm-hmm. So that has been one of my major, criteria for actually, agreeing, to take a job or not, based on, how would they actually want to work. But these days, I more and more tend to try to put myself into a situation where I'm basically just, here's a large project with lots of things that needs to be done, but here's a small corner of that's more or less self-contained, what Eric Evans would call, a bounded context. And if I can carve off a bounded context and say, well, I'll just take care of that, and that's going to be my stuff. I'm probably going to be the most productive and most helpful for everyone else, because that means I can just basically do things in whichever way that I want to, and don't really have to fight a lot of other people all the time. So I tend to try to put myself into a context where unless people really are eager to learn, I think it's much better for everyone if I just go in my corner and do whatever that is that that they need me to do, and then we don't really interfere too much with each other.
How do you?
Sure. How do I?
Pardon me. How do you frame that when I don't even know if you even interview anymore. How do you frame that when the project starts or when you get brought on board? I mean, because what I translate from that is because you have to like frame it in a really polite way of saying, "Hey, I'm not really interested in being the typical team player and taking one for the team. I really care about what I work on, and I prefer to work in this corner over here, isolated." I mean, that's the way I interpret it. I'm not sure of a
Sure.
more friendly way of saying that. Is there a certain way you frame it, or do you already have the credibility that they say, "Yes, Mark"?
Well, I think I probably have an advantage over most other people in this. I do have the credibility, and then also, I have some clients that I keep coming back to because they treat me well, and they know exactly, they know when. They know how to get value out of me. So, this is just a relationship you build up over time. But one of my clients, and the client that I'm working with at the moment, is one of those clients where they know what value that I can deliver, and they also know what not to ask me, because if they put me in the wrong position, then I tend to become less valuable, or maybe even more noisy, if you will. So
Okay.
and they've tried that, and we both agreed when we've tried that for a couple of months that that was not the best use of my abilities, and I completely agreed with them. And then we just said, well, let's try out something else. But this is also quite a mature organization, and that's probably why I keep coming back to it, because it's actually they know what they're doing in general.
The best use of your abilities. I'm starting to get into this because I'm like trying to learn as much as I can. You can send me the invoice after this is over. The best of your abilities. So there is a difference of opinion that I have versus what a consulting firm has.
Sure.
Um, I tend to say that my career is one of the few illusions that I have in which it's something that I control. Um, I'm gonna notice I put emphasis on illusion because I'm not sure if I really own it, right? Um, with that said, there's also argument that hey, when someone is especially as a contractor or consultant, when a company is paying you money, then it's not about what you want; it's what they want you to do.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on that? I see both sides, but
Right.
hey, I want to specialize in a specific area. So if you hire me as a programmer, I mean, this is extreme, but I'm not going to mop floors, right? No. If you pay me if you pay me based on what I sold you on when we had the
Hmm.
interview, and these are the areas that I really focus on: test automation, native application development, right? And there's a reason why I believe I'm productive, right? Because there's certain disciplines that I maintain that I hold myself to, and these disciplines I need because I believe that this is it encourages me to deliver a successful project. I wish I could say that differently. Like, what are your thoughts? Do you? I think you alluded to it earlier, where you said you go to your corner and you just bang it out and deliver. What happens when companies believe that you're one of the programmers that are a dime a dozen and they don't really treat you as a knowledge worker? They instead treat you as if you're a factory worker.
Right. But I'm not really sure that I can answer that question because I'm not in that position anymore.
Okay.
So I have the luxury to walk away from a project if it turns out to be that way. But I've never really experienced that for the last many years, because basically, if people agree to, pay the price that I ask them, they know that I'm not a dime a dozen, developer.
Mm. Yeah,
But
I'm still
again,
working on that.
yeah, and I did not start out that way, but that's basically that's one of the things that I now can do is, I can say, well, here's the price. And most people just run away screaming because that's too much. But then I've, pretty
Yeah,
much. effectively filtered out people who think that, one developer is interchangeable with another developer.
Hourly rate equals hourly productivity, apparently.
I do not, I don't really, yeah, yeah, from their perspective, that's what you mean, right? Right. But still, even if you're not still in that position, so I wasn't always in that position, I think there are things you can do in order to sort of carve out that little corner, if you will. So one of the things that I did early on in my career was just to say, well, I can see that we need to do all of these things. If it's a big project, you could list them up. We need to talk to databases. We need to have UI, and that's probably some JavaScript. And then we need to have the algorithmic motor over there here that does whatever. And you sort of can list up and say, well, here's all the things that I can see that we need to do, and I'm really good at this particular thing, because that's my forte, if you will. And what if we try to learn a little bit from Eric Evans, for example, from domain-driven design, and say, well, some of these things are actually parts of the system that can be fairly isolated. If you say, well, here's the part of the system that needs to do, whatever, and we can say, well, that's a bounded context. It's sort of like we don't really have to have it totally entirely integrated into the whole system, because we could sort of carve it off and say, well, that's a bounded context. And instead of saying that's something that I came up with, you appeal to authority. That always done with modesty, that's typically a good idea, because then if you don't have credibility yourself, you can always appeal to someone who has. So you can say, well, in domain-driven design by Eric Evans, he talks about these things called bounded context, and that's a good way to structure a large project so that that the interdependencies between all the team members are minimized a little bit. So you can sort of, I often started, and I did that earlier on in my career also, I talked about things in this way. So I never talked about what I wanted, because no one needs to know what I want. The only person who cares about what I want is me, right? So I never talked about what I wanted to do or what I would like to do. I just talked about, here's the things here's a way that we could subdivide the project, and here's how my strengths as a developer is, if I could work on this part over here, I would be able to provide much more value than if you wanted me to do like front-end development, because I know nothing about front-end development. So that would really be a poor use of my time. You know what I mean?
I hear you. I just thought again, like, I don't know, I guess reality is relative. I just had this expectation that when someone's paying you the money that you say you're worth based on what you've been delivering, that wants you to do everything. For example,
okay.
They want me to, you look at well, maybe you don't. Do you even look at job postings? And you see the 2 pages of requirements, which is the entire kitchen sink.
Right.
And so and then they have the nerve to pretty much say, oh, you don't have this one skill set out of the 100 skills that we listed, so we're not going to give you the maximum amount, right?
Right.
Why am I saying all this? Oh, yeah. My personal experience is, it's not really, it doesn't really occur on the job, but in order to get brought on by the gatekeepers, they expect you to be an expert in everything, they expect you to be a user experience designer. They expect you to be a DBA. They expect you to be an expert at everything.
I know. But there are 2 things to say about this. First of all, this is basically just a negotiation tactic that these people use. And there was, one of the most recent episodes of the Software Engineering Radio. That's another podcast. You should go and listen to that. That's actually an interview with a guy.
I was listening to the negotiating one 2 days ago.
Yeah, exactly about negotiation, and he talks a lot about it was Josh something. I can't remember his
Oh, okay.
last name. Yeah, but he talks about a lot of those things, where it's about negotiation tactics. And one of the things you're saying there is, the gatekeepers, they have an interest in getting you hired, but they also have an interest. So even though they take a percentage off, if they do that, if they take a percentage off your rate, it's still better to get you hired at a low rate than not getting you hired at all. So if they can, negotiate with you, even though it sort of sounds like they're negotiating on behalf of their client, whatever, if they can pressure you to take a lower hourly rate, they'll have a higher chance of actually being able to sell you to their client, and that means they make money. And if the client doesn't want to take you at all, then they make no money. So they actually have an interest in pressuring, in pushing your price down. And I worked for Microsoft Consulting back in the mid 2000s. So I was not quite in that same situation because I wasn't paid by the hour then. I was actually, a salaried employee, working for Microsoft, and then they, sold me at an hourly, rate, but I never really saw anything from that. But so they still had, an interest in trying to push the price down as much as possible. But obviously, whenever you have a salesperson that goes out and sells you to, do a job wherever, they have an interest in telling the client that you can do everything, because the more check boxes they can put in front of your skills, the more you can, the easier it is to sell you. But when you get into the actual situation, what I often found was that the people I had to work with on a daily basis were not the people who had done the original negotiation. So often so this is both good and bad, but the good thing about that is that when you're actually in the situation, the people you have to work with now, they don't know who you are at all. They have no idea who you are and what you can do. So even though you were originally sold as being able to do front-end development or being a UX expert or whatever, these people actually don't know what were sold. So you just start, you just assume they know nothing, and then you tell them what you can do, and you just leave out the things you don't want to do. At one point, I was actually getting pretty good at doing BizTalk server development.
There's a lot of money there. I picked up a certification book on it.
Yeah, but I really, really didn't like it. So, I just stopped telling people that I knew anything about, BizTalk server, because I didn't want to do it. And that, as long as you have something else to offer, that's fine. People just say, oh, well, he doesn't know anything about BizTalk server, and I'm just sitting there.
Yeah, when I studied, I don't know, you probably heard me on a couple programs, and
Sure.
I'm sorry, my motivation is money.
No, that's fair enough.
And that's my driving force. I don't think there's anything wrong with. I mean, I'm still writing code early in the morning and watching YouTube videos on software development late in the evening, right? Money is the major factor, right? I want to have that cushy, bougie lifestyle, but there's something that you said. I'm losing my train of thought again because I do so much talking. I can't think about it. Oh yeah. I was just going to say this has nothing to do with anything, but yeah, I saw the hourly rate for BizTalk server, and I'm like, oh, they're making like $115 an hour US. Oh, I'm only making like $65 or $75 an hour. Man, I want the $115,000. So or 115, yeah, dollars an hour. So I just started picking up books on BizTalk server. I got the certification book, and what it introduced me to was this notion of a message bus. And when I'm doing object-oriented programming, that really helps me out in regards to decoupling systems. But
Sure.
that's enough of that. This is just a side thought. Here's a question, right? And I know your time is precious, so I'll wrap it up. You've been going full throttle. Actually, I have two questions. But this one is, you've been going full throttle about coding, right? And how to build maintainable modules or systems. Have you ever considered making money discussing, writing, speaking on the human factor of software development?
I have, yes. And this may happen in the future.
Okay.
And I can't say it's something that I'm still, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how to do that. So I don't really have that much more to say about that at the moment, because I don't really know exactly where that's going to end up. But this is something that I am thinking about.
Do you fear that it's going to take away from your current professional brand in which you're laser focused on functional programming?
I think these things are related because, well, what I can say, this is sort of like what I already discussed with Dave Rail, earlier on, is that I think, one of the major problems that we have in software development is readability of code, because most code needs to be read later on. And if you can't understand what it,
Okay.
if you can't understand what it does, then you have a maintainability problem. It's not really, it doesn't have to be more complicated than that at all. And one of the reasons why I think functional programming is very interesting is because it makes, if you really dive into the functional thinking, it makes it easier to think about the code. It makes it easier to read the code because it does fewer things. Things are, it's easier to decouple things, basically.
I would say not only if you can't understand what it does, but when you do not yet understand what it affects, in regards to the side effects or cascading effects on other parts of the system.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's the next question, which I think I already know the answer to, is so I had this phone screen a couple days ago, and they were asking me about Xamarin Forms, and they're like, it came down to this custom renderer class that is used to provide some native user experience within the Xamarin Forms application. Xamarin Forms is basically a general like abstraction or whatever. Sure. And they asked me like, and I told them, what it's for and how it's used. But then they were like, well, tell me what code is required to implement whatever methods that belong to this custom renderer. And I'm like, I'm almost positive I wrote a tutorial maybe a couple years ago on this subject, but I can't. I told you why you would use it, but I can't tell you the exact syntax. That's the reason why I maintain a technical blog, so I can refer to it later.
Sure.
Of course, that makes sense. But my question to you is, how important is it to really know the ins and outs, or translate it, memorize the various methods that are supported, etc. How important that in marketing yourself or trying to sell yourself?
Right.
Because I feel like if you're an expert, then people that know nothing about software expect you to be like a doctor and memorize the handbook.
Right. Yeah. So what you're actually asking about, how important is it to know all sorts of trivia,
Yeah.
about core libraries and whatever. And I think there's an unfortunate tendency to, again, this is boiling down to people measuring whatever they can measure, even because the most important stuff is something you can't measure. So instead of giving up and saying we can't measure anything, then people start measuring whatever they can measure. And one of the things they can measure is how good are you at and answering trivia questions about software development. And I'm pretty certain that if you put me up in any sort of trivia competition about even .NET and F#, I'd probably lose big to whoever else you put me up against, because I'm not really good at that stuff. I think it's important to know that things exist. I think it's good to have a general idea that oh, there's a function or a method or whatever that could do something like this, and I'll need to go and look it up to figure out, what are the details of usage actually. So knowing things exist is important, but knowing exactly what that function is called and the order, the ordering of the arguments and whatever, most of the time, even in a dynamically typed language, you can always look up the documentation or whatever and figure that out, instead of trying to waste your mental energy on actually remembering all of those things. But what I think is much more important is to have a general sense that, I've met lots of developers who, if they don't know that a particular method or function exists, they start writing the implementation themselves. And basically what I think more people should have is to say, whenever you're trying to solve a general problem, someone has probably already solved that for you. So now you should go and try to figure out, okay, how do I actually, where can I find an implementation of this? Because, that's what I often see people say. Well, they sort of diverge. They get sidetracked by something because they say, oh, that's a general purpose problem. That's really interesting. And they start to write their own cache invalidation system or whatever it is that they, that is a totally general purpose thing. Instead of just saying, well, I'll spend, 15 minutes on Google trying to figure out, does this actually exist? And it probably does. And then just figure out how to use that instead.
Okay.
So I'm not really big on trivia, but, obviously, since I write a lot of code every day, there are certain things that I just pick up and can do, by rote, because, if you do it enough, then it's just sort of, you can't really forget about it anyway, and that's fine. But it's unfortunate that lots of people want to measure those things. I think it's a completely irrelevant interview question whether you can remember specifics about how to do custom renderers in Xamarin Forms. I think the most important thing is do you know what a custom renderer in Xamarin Forms is? Do you know why it's interesting to have it? If you do that, you can probably we should trust you to be able to figure out the rest.
Yeah, you would think. And it's more of like me just being curious what your thoughts on of what really matters versus what's reality. And if you broadcast that you are advanced or some type of expert in the area, I was curious about if you're telling people that, then should you hold yourself to this really high standard of, and this reminds me of when I took the WPF certification. I knew hella trivia about WPF, and it was useful when it came to like troubleshooting low-level things, right?
Sure.
Like, and so, it's just something that I thought about, even though I'm like, who cares? Of course, I didn't tell him that. I just maintained like a professional face and
Sure.
try to stay humble. In a way, I'm like, well, just because I don't, I like to stay in my reality as much as I can, but that doesn't mean that I have to comply with real reality. And so I wasn't quite sure, in order to advance my career, how much of a priority it is. If I say that I know this, how far do I have to go? In regards to the person that is going to be writing the check or the gatekeeper. So
Right.
I think you answered it for the most part.
Yeah. Well, as I say, it's unfortunate, but sometimes, those gatekeepers are actually there and they ask in my opinion, the wrong questions. There was a couple of weeks ago, there was this little story going around when someone was interviewed for a position as CTO for, I think it was in Google even, but it was a really important position in Google. And the interviewer, the screener, started asking this person about some things about, how do you do very low level things in Linux? And, the first couple of questions went really well for the candidate. And then, they started to diverge because so the screener was asking some questions, and the candidate had more than expected knowledge about the subject. So instead of just saying giving the expected answer, he actually gave a very nuanced answer, saying, well, normally you would blah blah blah, but in this case you wouldn't blah blah blah, and so on. So he really started to diverge because he actually knew more than the people who had originally written down the questions, and it just kept on going like that, where the screener says, well, that's actually not the correct answer, and the guy says, well, bloody hell is the correct answer because I wrote the damn thing or whatever. But it ended up actually he was screened out of the program and never really offered to continue on with that system. So that happens, and everyone can agree in this case it's so ridiculous that it's that everyone understands how ridiculous it is. But I think it happens more, and people just don't realize that it's actually a pretty stupid way to screen people. I don't know. But then again, I don't know if Google is still doing this, but like 5 years ago, they had a very explicit policy of saying, we can make hiring decisions. It's always good when we make the right hiring decisions, but we can make wrong hiring decisions in two different ways. We can hire the wrong persons, or we can, not hire the right person.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I heard
and
that
they said,
before.
And they said, well, the cost of hiring the wrong person is much higher than not hiring the right person. So they had a screening process that said, well, we know that we are going to, say no to some people who would actually have been good for us. But it's more important for us to screen out the bad ones that actually, let all the good ones in. And that was a very, very explicit decision they make back then. I may mix this up with, maybe it wasn't Google, maybe it was some other company.
It was Google, because I thought I heard it on Software Engineering Radio.
And I'm not sure that they do that anymore. Maybe they've changed policy. I don't know. But at a particular point in time, they were very explicit about that. And I think, if you explicitly have that as a policy, well, then you've made a conscious decision, and then you can't really argue against that at all. And I'm pretty sure, by the way, that I would totally flunk those Google, questionnaires if I was ever being, subjected to those, because, exactly what I told you, I don't really walk around with all that trivia in my head. So
are you sure? Do I need to pull up your Stack Overflow? Like, you're at like what? Are you at 180,000 yet?
I don't know, more than 100,000. That's basically, I don't know, between 100 and 200.
Okay. Yeah, it's like I said at the very start. Like, if I contributed a fraction, like a quarter of what you've contributed to this industry, I mean, I'm arrogant already, right? But like talking to you, it's like I'm just listening, not really responding to anything. I'm just soaking it in, right? But I mean, that can be archived for another time. I think something happened, right? This is me trying to like be a psychic, or I don't know, whatever I can't think of it. I'm tired, but I feel like there's something that happened where you knew how smart you were, and then something happened where you found out that you really need to humble yourself. But I'll say that for another discussion somewhere in the future, because like that's the first thing I noticed about you is like you're quick to I'm at a loss for vocabulary, but you're quick to downplay your contribution.
Oh, that probably just
I
goes.
really appreciate you having a conversation with me. I know I've been borderline harassing you, but I translate that as me being persistent to get what I want. And I'm thankful that you did take some time to mentor me for an hour. You can send me an invoice, and so
sure.
What's the name of your blog?
It's just called Plur blog.
Okay.
I use that word everywhere, so yeah.
And they can probably find you on Twitter with the same word, same term. And do you have any upcoming conferences that people would be interested in viewing?
Well, I hope so. I'll be at NDC London here in January 2017. I'll give a workshop, actually two workshops on F-sharp development, and NDC will also have a mini conference in Copenhagen. This is where I live, so yeah, I'll be there as well.
That's
That's
gonna
what
be.
I have, for plans so far. It's been a long time since I've been to the US and done something
Come
over
to
there.
Miami.
So
We can
yeah,
hang out.
I
South
would love
Beach.
to. I have been to Miami and it's wonderful. So yeah, absolutely. The only problem I have with that is that American conferences tend to not pay for my travel. So um,
Really?
yeah, yeah. And I'm sort of like, why should I? Do you want me to pay out of my own pocket to come over and talk at your conference? And sort of like, you know, I can make. I can probably spend my time better then. But if
I
the
find
right
that
opportunity comes up, I'd love to come.
I find that there tends to be more F sharp speakers that have visibility in Europe compared to
Yeah,
the States. I mean, Rachel Reese is in the public spotlight, but
sure.
besides that, I just don't hear about that many thought leaders here in the States that discuss F sharp specifically. But yeah, that's a shame.
Yeah,
If I knew other F sharp developers, I would try to like rally support to
sure.
bring you over here and compensate you. But unfortunately, F sharp isn't really huge
I
where
know.
I live. It may be gaining traction on Wall Street, which I doubt because I went there like 3 weeks ago to look for opportunities. But all right, I'm blabbing, but hey, or babbling. Thank you, Mark. I
Yeah,
appreciate it. I'm
yeah.
going to hit
Thank
the
you.
button in 3, 2, 1.